So I chose poverty to do my equity classroom project on because a lot of my students are within the lower income, and so is a majority of our students. So I figured that this would just be the best for me to do, and I chose the curriculum and creating a unit for my kindergarten classroom. So this is kind of a 5-day unit that focuses on different aspects each day, but focuses on the overall poverty as a whole. So it'd start off with day 1. So day 1 would be an activity. Day 2 would be reading a book. The book is called Katie's Cabbage. Day 3 would be focused on retelling the story. Day 4, we would actually visit the garden that we have in our school. And day 5 would be a review and discuss kind of what we were talking about for the week and what poverty is. So let's look at day 1. So day 1 is an introduction to poverty. We would begin by doing an activity, and on the activity, I would give each of my students a piece of paper with a plate drawn on it, and I have 4 students at each table with 4 tables. And so some of my students will receive a drawing of food on their paper plate, while others will not. And then we will begin to eat our food and then talk about what was the difference between some of our foods versus ones that may not have gotten food. So a question I would ask everybody is, did we all have food on our plate? And I would kind of just get more or less the student-led answers and letting them decide why and determine kind of like their own definition of poverty. And then we would focus back on what is poverty. So then after we kind of discussed a little bit about that first activity, I would continue on and we'd look at this picture. We'd look at the visual arts standard and we'd look at this picture and be like, what is going on in this picture? What do we notice? We notice that she's holding a spoon. Maybe she just ate. She looks like she cleared her whole entire plate. She drank most of her milk. She's licking her lips. She's not hungry anymore. She's pretty full. And then we would say, how do you think this student feels? Does she look happy? Look at her face. Look at the way she's holding the spoon. And then after we talked about that for a minute, we'd look at this picture and say, well, what does this picture show? Well, we can notice she doesn't have any milk like the other little girl. She doesn't have any food on her plate. She has a fork and a spoon, but she doesn't have any food on her plate. What's going on? And we would say, how do you think this student feels? Well, on her face, you can tell that she's sad. She doesn't have a happy face. She kind of has a frown on her eyebrows or a certain way. And so we would talk about that a little bit more, kind of have it more student-led. And that would give this quote of nearly 1 in 6 children are within poverty in the United States. So I've kind of talked a little bit about what this means, as in 1 in 6. So if we have 15 kids, that would be 2 to 3 kids in our class that could possibly be living in poverty. And that kind of goes with in school or when you go out in public. And it's not saying people in our class are in poverty. I'm not saying that, but just giving them a rough estimate. And I would make sure that they know that and not to look around and, judge anybody or anything like that. But then after that, we would actually start talking about poverty. So what is poverty? Poverty is where people are not getting their needs met due to low income, not making enough money. They're having to do other things. And then another question is, how do we treat people in poverty? Are we kind to them? Are we mean to them? Do we leave them out? How do we treat people in poverty? And I'd let the students kind of discuss that with a partner too and do turn and talk. And then have them maybe share what their partner said or share their own thinking. And then we would say, how do we get rid of poverty? Like, how do we lessen the amount of people that are maybe in our community? How do we lessen the people in poverty who are hungry an aspect? Because we, as a school, focus on hunger a little bit more versus other things. So then day 2, we would get into the story, Katie's Cabbage. And I have it on this slide. I have a video. I am not going to play it because it is long. But we would watch the video, or we would actually have the book, and I would read the book with my kids. That way they can actually see the book, hold the book if they want to, and we can go through and flip through the pages and re-look at it the next day when we're retelling the story. So here's the book if you have never read it. So this story is an inspirational true story. It's about a 3rd grader from South Carolina, and she actually grew a 40-pound cabbage in her backyard, and she was able to help feed 275 people within her community. So we can resonate with Katie through, we actually have our own garden at school, and we are able to produce and harvest vegetables, and we actually give them back to the community sometimes. We give them to the lunch ladies, and they use it for lunch, or we'll go out and we will go to different neighborhoods and pass them out if we have extras at the end of the year. But we do give it out to the community as needed. And I thought that this would be a really good book because the kids can kind of see, oh, why is she doing this? Why did she grow a cabbage? Especially this big, how many people did she feed after it? So I'm going to skip that. And then after we read what's the story, we'd have to get in through centers and all things like that. But the next day, day 3, we would kind of go back and review Katie's cabbage and retelling the story. So I would focus on the 5-finger retell. We've talked about characters and settings so far, and we've kind of talked about like the central message and what the whole book is about. But we would say, what is the story about? What happened? Who were the characters? What did the characters do in the story? What was the setting? What happened at the beginning, middle, and end of the story? And things like that. And I would kind of have the kids also turn and talk to a partner and then share out their findings. And then we would come back together and we'd say, what can we do to help people in poverty within our own community? And focus it in on, people that the kids already know. So then day 4, we would actually go and visit our school garden. We do have a school garden. Kindergarten actually does a PBL where we focus it on it all year long, and we harvest vegetables and we give it out back to the community. And once they're all grown, and like I was saying, we give it to our lunch ladies and things like that. So depending on the time of the year, it would say harvest as needed. So summertime and springtime, we would be harvesting more than during the winter. But we do plant winter vegetables. So these are not our gardens. I do not have a picture of it without kids, and I did not want to post student pictures on here, but we have 6 garden beds where kids are planting. They are fixing up the soil to be able to plant. They're planting seeds. We're taking care of it, watering it, pulling out weeds. And then once the vegetables are all grown, we do harvest them into a bucket. We put them into a bucket. And sometimes if we have an overabundance, we do send some of the vegetables home with the kids if they want to bring something home. So then our big thing that we talk about is Project Zero Hunger. And the kids know that very well because we've talked about it since August, since the first week of school. So then we can talk about how can we use our garden to help people in need. And the kids should know the answer to this question because, like I said, we've been talking about it for a while, but we would reevaluate it and talk and bring it a little bit more into poverty and what we were discussing this week. So then day 5, we would focus on the discussion and writing activity. So we would discuss the same questions that we talked about at the beginning of the week, just as a reminder. So what is poverty? How do we treat people in poverty? And then how do we get rid of poverty or lessen poverty? Because it's a tough one to get rid of completely. And I would let the kids know too that we wouldn't be able to get rid of it completely, but we can lessen it with the parts of poverty, especially including hunger. So then at the end of the week, during writing, we can focus on our writing, having them draw a picture of what they learned this week, draw a picture and write a sentence. And depending on the student, a few of my students can write independently. and they're starting to sound out their words, so they're starting to form words. And then depending on the student as well, I wouldn't include that many lines. I'd probably include like 1 or 2 for my students that are still working on writing sentences. And then my students that are blending and they're able to write sentences, I would probably give them this paper because I feel like that would be a good amount. But we are still working on letter formation with all of my students because a lot of them are writing big in the lines. But with this lesson, I can incorporate reading and ELA and writing, math through counting the amount of kids that got food on their plates versus didn't, retelling stories. I can bring this into social studies as in who is a good citizen, what does a good citizen do, showing kindness, and we can even bring it into our social emotional learning with how do we treat people that are in poverty.